Hello. All right, this is audience participation. I like to be as not boring as possible, if that's even a thing. So my name is Bret. This will be the third time at Docker that I have done a Node.js talk. So this is a refresh. And I always think, I'll just do 5 slides. It'll change 5 slides. Everything in this is different. Because there's so much new Docker stuff. Node has had a few changes, that changed a few commands, a few things. So we're going to have an adventure together, and I want you to yell out, and if I ask a question, it's hopefully yes or no kind of thing. Again, audience participation, and then I'm going to leave plenty of time for questions, because we could make this a 3-hour conversation, right? I have a whole course on Node.js for Docker on Udemy, and it's not 45 minutes. So I want to make sure that if you have questions that I don't address, some of the things in this talk I'm actually going to say, if you need to know about that, go to my previous year where I went, and they're all online on YouTube, and then watch that to answer that specific question, so that because I keep adding new stuff and I can't fit it all in. So I want to focus on things that are new and latest, so that you get all the new stuff for this year. And the design here is that, who is it for, right? So you know some Node, you know some Docker, and you want to be awesome at it. And I work with a lot of teams as an advisor a lot of times, not just an implementer, but I'm looking at their stuff and advising on how to improve it, streamline things, make them simpler, also more secure, stuff like that. So we're going to go for awesome sauce mode today, and we're going to go over 4 main things, and then we're going to end with a production checklist. So we're going to start with Node Dockerfile best practices. This isn't your basic 101 stuff you get on the internet. This is more than that. And then we're going to talk a little bit about base images, because we got new exciting things to talk about, and then there's also the valley of despair of, like, it's hard, right? To go from day 1 to true production enterprise grade Node images is harder than you think it is. Some of you probably have great experiences and wonderful tales to tell about all the things you've tried. We're going to talk about process startup and shutdown, although most of that is actually going to be me referring you to previous years, because I went on for like 15 minutes about it to give you all the nitty-gritty, but we'll cover the basics of that. Then we're going to talk about some new Compose stuff, because I love Compose. It's still, even with all the teams I work with on Kubernetes and all the fancy tools, Compose is still the place we keep coming back to for local development, optimization, and simplifying the dev setup, because I'm an ops guy at heart, but I want development to be as simple as we can make it, right? So we all want this beautiful idea of a magical development stack that looks just like production, but also extremely easy to use and is fast. That's hard to do, right? So I still love Compose because it's local, it's quick, it's simple, the file is easy to understand, and there's a lot of new updates in the last couple of years, especially if you didn't see my talk last year or the one in 2019. So let's just jump right into the Dockerfile, because that tends to be the first place that people start making ill-advised decisions. And the internet gets a lot of things wrong. In fact, the talk I used to say was like, who's seen this 101 on the internet? Raise your hands, right? Every blog post of the last 10 years has been, this is how you do Node. Well, can anyone identify, if you just want to yell out, and I'll repeat it for the mic for people online, can anyone yell out anything they see wrong with this file? There's a dozen things wrong probably. Just copying in everything. Yep, down there at the bottom. There's 2 copy commands, which is technically correct. What else? Anyone see anything else? Just yell it out. Base image, right? We definitely have room for improvement there, right? That's every Docker 101 example, but it's probably not the image that anyone ever on the internet should ever be using. I have opinions. The work dir, there's actually been some changes in the last 3 years, and now the work dir doesn't actually correctly assigns permissions, but you'll notice we're still using root, because the Node image, just like all Docker images, default to easy mode, which doesn't mean the most secure best mode. So back in 2013, when they made these images, they were going for simplification, ease of use, and we'll get into that and why we want to change all that. So if we just revamp that and say, what if this was your day 1, this isn't necessarily production ready, but day 1 image. You've got tier 1 supported builds, meaning, if you didn't know, in Node land, the Node project supports different compilations and different platforms, essentially, for Node, and they have tier rankings of what is tier 1, and this is the best, it's for production, you know, you can get support contracts, stuff like that for tier 1. Tier 2 means we do best, we try, it's not as important, but we try, and then experimental is beta. It's like it may work, it may not, we don't guarantee anything. Weirdly, or maybe ironically, even Docker recommends sometimes the Alpine image, which you will hear me talk about today in not a nice way. Alpine, the project, is a fantastic project. I never recommend Node Alpine in production. I've worked for 10 years, I worked for almost 15 years with Node and 10 years with Docker. Eventually, every project that I'm on, if they're doing large-scale Node stuff in production, they will eventually have problems that are Alpine specific. Mostly due to Musel, which is the way that things are compiled in Alpine, and there's other reasons. BusyBox is sometimes a problem. So you won't see me recommending Alpine today, but don't worry, I've got lots of recommendations for you that are even better. So tier 1, meaning you want an image that is on a tier 1 supported build of Node, and Alpine is the one that's set to experimental. Next up, we're pinning the image. So in case you didn't know about pinning of images, it's been around a while, but I can guarantee that I'm getting the exact same base image because tags can be reused, right? In this case, I'm using Node 20, so I'm not pinning to the patch level version, but I am SHA-hashing it. Now, technically, when you SHA-hash an image like this, when you put that hash in that you can get from just doing a Docker images command, there's actually like a -- show digest or something like that. I forget the command. But you can get those hashes. Technically, it's ignoring the tag, but the tag is for the humans to know what we pinned in the file. So when you pin a SHA-hash, it ignores the tag. We're just using it as a friendly label to know what the heck it's from. So the Node 20 bookworm means that's the version of Debian that this is based on, which is the latest Debian. And then Slim, always use Slim images. In every programming language in Docker Hub, if you can get official images, always use Slim. You never want the non-Slim variant of Debian. And you'll see why in a minute. We're running as non-root. Now, something changed in the last 3 years so that I can now put the user node in there, which is built into the official node images by default. The user already exists. I can put that there to run as non-root. This is key. A lot of Kubernetes clusters, especially in sectors like government and financial and whatnot, will not allow a container to run as root. So you have to do that. And if I do that before Workter now, I actually learned this earlier this year, that it was 2 years ago, about 3 years ago maybe, that they updated the Workter so that it assigns the proper permissions based on the user above it. So you put user in first, you make it non-root, and then when you create that Workter, it will properly give Node user permissions, so you don't have to assign those manually. If you're someone who's taken my Node courses, the way I used to tell you to do is you had to type make dir and do all these things in a run command. But you don't have to do that anymore, it's easier. Then there's the copy, so we're copying with the right permissions because now we're as a regular user, not a root user, so we have to use the chown anytime we do a copy. And then you see that, so you see that in multiple levels there, and we have the package and the actual copying of the rest of the source code in. And then what's next? We're doing npm CI. This is actually incorrect because I just learned today that the npm CI has changed 3 times now, or twice. This is the 3rd rendition. So you'll see in future slides that it technically should be npm CI omit dev is what you want. -- omit dev. You'll see it in the slides, and it's also in this repo. In case you didn't see, I'll put it again at the end of the slides. There's a whole repo with all this stuff in it, example Dockerfiles, and I keep updating that repo every year. So you can get all these notes and a lot more detail. It's a tomb of information, really. So you're doing the npm CI that removes dev dependencies or prevents dev dependencies, and then we're not running npm or any other process manager yet in the command. We don't want to use npm ever in production to start things that are going to be the long-serving process, and you'll learn why in a little bit. So I've actually changed my opinion about some things as tools change in the industry, and one of them was I used to teach people that this may be for you a great way to do your npm audits, your Trivy scans, any of your CVE security scans, maybe you can make a stage in a multi-stage Dockerfile. And I'm now saying, no, we're not going to do that anymore. One of my hopes in the industry was that the CI tools out there would start looking at build stages and Docker commands, or essentially each Docker step, as a thing that they can light up in their CI solution, so that we basically can use a Dockerfile to do a lot of our CI and a lot of the automation, testing and all the other things we need to do. That didn't happen in the industry, so even though I kept advocating for Docker build as the way to do this, I don't recommend that anymore. All the modern CIs, GitHub Actions, GitLab and all of them, have better support natively to do your NPM audits and your CVE scans and stuff like that. So I don't recommend these stages anymore, which is great. It simplifies our Dockerfile. We don't have to do it. Talk about Docker init. So this is a new thing. You heard about it in the keynote. Docker init allows you to start a project from scratch, which means it comes with an opinionated Dockerfile. And this is kind of what it would look like if you ran that command. So if you're brand new day one to Docker, Docker now at least has this init option like every other package manager and tool in the world. So it's great. It's great for new people. I have opinions. It's one of those things where nothing's ever perfect or universal for everyone, right? And you basically give it a bunch of questions, or it gives you a bunch of questions, you give it a bunch of answers, and then it creates 3 files, which is pretty great to start with. It starts with the Docker ignore, it starts with the Dockerfile, and it gives you a compose file. By the way, compose files now, the standard is compose.yaml is the default, not docker-compose.yml, which is what all of us that have been doing this for 10 years have been typing. It still supports all the old file names, but this is the new convention, is compose.yaml. So it creates those files for you and then recommends, to do Docker Compose up for you. So let's just take a quick look at that real quick while we have time. And what does it, it's a different file. So over here, if I look at the Docker file, it's actually pretty fancy. We have the syntax at the top in case you weren't familiar. Docker has, the build kit is now the default builder, so we have this thing called frontends that allows it, build kit, to update dynamically and support a lot of new features. So there's a lot of new stuff happening in the Docker file, but it's not necessarily in the OCI spec. It's happening in the build kit and through something called frontend. So if you put that syntax line in, what that basically guarantees is when all of your team members build images or your CI builds images, assuming they're all using BuildKit, as they should be because it's still the best container builder, they will all have the same support for the same feature set inside the building of your image, which if you start to use advanced features is important. And we'll talk about a few of those eventually. In fact, we'll talk about one of them right now. So this is a heavily documented file. This is all generated by Docker. And you'll see things like it mounts files into the build time, right? So this is a fancy BuildKit front-end feature. It's been around for years. I don't always use or recommend this. I have to look at the team and decide how many, like, are they installing 200 megs worth of node modules or 1,000 megs of node modules? Because I've seen both. And if you have the bigger your node modules, the more likely caching, this isn't caching node modules, this is caching the installation of those node modules. So the downloads of those zips before they're expanded into node modules. So it'll save you internet trips on building. It does require you to use BuildKit because I do believe this is a very specific thing to the Docker builder for BuildKit. Again, that's fine because it's the best one. And so they give you this nice little file where it helps you optimize that, and it has a bunch of stages where it copies in files. And this is all fine. I do find that with teams I work with, that if they're new to Node in Docker, this is a lot to take in. This is and so I try to teach and help teams crawl before they walk and walk before they run. This is a little bit closer to a fast walk, so maybe not the day one Dockerfile, but hey, it's great. Docker gives it to us. The one thing that I don't agree with is that they default to they default to Alpine, which again, I was talking to several people at the conference that after 10 years of trying to help teams using Alpine in production, I've kind of given up and don't recommend it. What else does it do? It gives you the compose file, which we're going to talk about in a little bit, but it lights up some pretty sweet new features in Dockerfiles because we now have the compose spec. So you probably know now if you're an avid compose user, we no longer have compose versions in the file. We now support all the features of versions 2 and versions 3. Even in the keynote, someone snuck in a file with a v3.4 in it, which is considered legacy. No versions needed. All features are available in the compose command line as long as you remove the compose version. And we're going to talk about health checks and other stuff here in a minute, so I'm not going to go too much more into that. All right. So the perfect base image. This is my favorite part of the talk because I could either talk for 5 minutes or 50 minutes on this topic, but a lot of time gets spent in most teams I work with on finding the right base image that has all the things they need and then none of the vulnerabilities they don't want. It's small. It meets all these 3 or 4 different metrics, right? And it doesn't exist, right? This is very specific to your team, and almost every team I work with chooses a different path based on their culture, based on their requirements, based on the security team's involvement. And it's a balancing act. The more secure and smaller you make it, the more advanced you're going to have to be to use it. So it just depends on what you need in your team. And some teams are perfectly fine with one of the default official images. So let's start with the first 3. Never use the top one, ever in your life. Use it. There's 0 reasons to use it. One of the big negatives besides, you can see all these CVEs. So this is me using multiple scanners in the industry, 2 open source, 2 commercials. You'll notice a trend that the commercials tend to have less false positives. This is something I actually recently discovered, and I've had multiple conversations this week about that. There's definitely a huge difference between, in some images, between the open source scanners and the commercial ones that are specifically applying issues to each one that might be a false positive. They tend to be fixing them faster. I'm not really sure what's going on in the background. Doesn't mean you can't use an open source scanner, but to me, it's kind of like, Docker Scout is working great, and it's really new. And it's not perfect yet, but the team's taking a lot of feedback. You'll see here that we have actually a couple of images that Docker Scout's not perfect on. It doesn't scan it correctly. But I always start people with Slim, the second one. Right? Slim is way smaller, right? It's less than 1/4 the size, huge difference in the CVE count, and it has everything you need to run Node. The problem we have with the base image, the original and the top one, is that I'll see teams, especially when they need they need OS package manager dependencies. So they need apt and yum. And what happens with this, the first one, is it has tons of stuff in it, and people, when they get their first image working, it'll work. But then if they try to use Slim, it'll fail the build because there's a missing dependency that they didn't specify, because they didn't realize in their day 1 Docker experience that the default Node image has mercurial in it. It has image magic. It has so many things that we don't need in a Node image usually. So when those things are there, it has all the build tools, so you can do binary builds. Sometimes you need that. But usually you want to specify those things by putting in your own run line, right? So you get the point there. So I don't recommend that. The Alpine one has great CVE stuff, but because of various reasons that you can listen to my previous talk years, and then if you just go to the repo, I put in lots of details about pros and cons. I generally don't recommend the Alpine, even though it is now nice and small. We can get smaller than Alpine without the negative side effects of Musil and BusyBox. So the next 3 I'm going to show you are the Debian, just to give you a comparison. So these Node images that are official from Docker Hub are based on Debian, which means that a lot of the vulnerabilities, if we're focused on that, come from the base image. Node can't do anything about them. So the 12 Slim, for example, has a few less, but it still has some vulnerabilities. And then you can see Ubuntu. So Ubuntu is going to be one of my recommended images for you. I'm going to give you 3 recommendations in a minute, but we've got to take the journey to get there, right? So traditionally, for those of us that are sysadmins, when we think of Ubuntu, we think of LTSs like 2004 and 2204. Those are long-term stable releases of Ubuntu. You don't necessarily have to do that in a container image, because if you need to change from 2204 to 2304, it's just a 1-line change, and in theory, you're getting newer dependencies, and in this case, you actually can see that there's less vulnerabilities in the 2304. You sacrifice a little bit of that long-term availability of package manager stuff, but that's getting into the weeds a little bit. I'm not going to talk about that today. So you might have an opinion in your company where I see companies where they say, well, we only use Ubuntu LTS images. And I know multiple companies on AWS and Azure that their approach to all their own base images is they start with Ubuntu and they build their own images from there. And I'll show you a couple of ways to do that. One way you can do it in Node specifically is you can make Ubuntu, which is a very small image, right? The Ubuntu 2204 is smaller than all the others, 69 meg. And it's great because it has the classic Ubuntu enterprise support built in. It has the long-term apps package manager stuff built in. It's well supported on the internet, well documented. And you can add in the official Node binaries with the Node source. So anyone here familiar with Node source? You've heard of Node source. Like you've probably, if you've ever installed or built Node, you know about Node source. So you can make a Dockerfile, which is in the repo for this. It shows you how to build this. And then you just install their Node source. One negative of that method is that the Node source team, even though I've complained, requires Python in order to install Node. So the Node image in this case now has Python and all its dependencies, which will bring vulnerabilities to your Node package. I don't like that. That's why I'm using Node, not Python, so I don't like that option. The next option is what I'm calling like a side load, where you can use the copy command in your Dockerfile to simply copy all the binaries out of the Node image into the Ubuntu image. And now you don't need apt, you don't need all that extra stuff. You get just what you want. It's a smaller image. You can tell here 225, so it's leaner than the others. And it has a small vulnerability count. There's no highs or criticals in any of the scanners. One negative of this approach, though, is that it means that the binaries are probably not going to be picked up by your CVE scanner, except for Sneak. Yay, Sneak. Sneak detects those binaries even though they're not installed by apt, and gave me, it reported that there was no vulnerabilities. I'm hoping that Docker Scout will do that one day, and I'm going to let them know that they should. Then we have, after that, the idea of moving Ubuntu to 2304, and you can see the results in the scans there. It's a couple less CVEs because 2304 has newer dependencies in Ubuntu than 22. And then lastly, the last two we're going to talk about is distroless. Who here is anyone using distroless? Got one up front? So distroless is a cool idea. I have issues, and you'll see the little dots, the little 3 and the 4. Those are referring to the GitHub repo where this is all at. You'll see on the last slide again. It was on the first slide. But the distroless has side effects. You can't pin a lot of things. It doesn't keep versions over time the way I wish it would. And it also, because of the way it's designed, it doesn't have apt installed or anything. So it has to be the last stage, which means you inherently have to have an advanced Dockerfile, and you have to know that you have to have build images and then production images that you copy everything into this distroless image. So I consider it an advanced solution, but it still has vulnerabilities in it. So, in fact, in some cases, it might have more vulnerabilities than the Ubuntu one. So why would I use it because the point of distro was to keep it small and secure. Distroless, that is. And it's not always that best choice. So the new one out there is ChainGuard. Who's here has heard of ChainGuard? Anyone? Okay, we got a couple. So ChainGuard is a software supply chain security company. They've been on in case you didn't know, I do a YouTube live stream about this stuff every week. I have guests. Come onto YouTube, join me there. We're live every Thursday. I'll be live tomorrow here somewhere in this building. And I had ChainGuard on last year, and I loved it. They are basically, what my opinion or how I would describe what they're doing with Wolfi is that they're taking Docker official images and they're going back and redesigning them from scratch and then maintaining them themselves to get it to 0 CVEs across the board. And they're very public about it. These are free images. They have a paid plan that allows you to do a few more things with these images, but you get a lot out of the box for free. They have their own registry. I highly recommend them. For any team that starts, this would be one of my top 3, if not number 1 image that I would have them trying to use. It is a little advanced. It does require a little bit of understanding because when these images get really small like this, they don't have shells, right? They don't necessarily have all the packages you need. So it does get a little harder. So that leads me to this slide. This is my recommendations. They're not in any order. They are dependent upon your team and what they might need. So if you're going to want to use an official image, which is easy mode, comes out of the box, that's the Node Slim, right? It currently has no, according to Sneak and Docker Scout, it has no critical or high vulnerabilities, so only low and mediums. I should have defined that at the beginning, sorry. It's defined on the website, I apologize. And then the second image there is the one we built, where I side-loaded, and if you wanted to see what that looks like, it's pretty simple. I don't know if that's the right term, but I'm making up that term, side-load. So if you looked at copy, so in this file, this is how I get Node into this. This is a regular Ubuntu image, and the way I get Node in it is I use the copy from. And this is a legitimate way. I see multiple teams out there doing this for other types of images. So I define both of my images at the top. I say, here's my Node image, and here's my Ubuntu image that I'm going to use the Node one later, but I want to define them all at the top so I can track versions. I should be SHA hashing these so that I have the hash to guarantee I get that exact image each time. And then I'm giving them an alias. And then we'll talk about Teeny here in a little bit. But here I am side-loading Node in by copying it from one image to another. Because I trust the official Node image for building the correct Node version. And since I can specify the Node version coming from Docker Hub, I know exactly what binaries I'm getting. I just need to get them in here without maybe the side effects of node source or Python being loaded or apt package dependencies that I don't really need. And I've tested this in production, this is an example I've been giving out for like 4 years, and I haven't had any negative effects so far. So there's that. So those 3 options are for you. And then you got chain guard there at the bottom, right? So the Node latest image. If you want to pin versions on chain guard, they changed their policy recently because of their increased success. And if you want pinned versions in the tag, you need to sign up for one of their paid plans. But you can always pin the SHA hash, like I'm recommending, and that's essentially getting you the same thing, because they're always going to make those SHA hashes available, and you can depend on those. So let's move on. All right, process management. How many people here know about an init process or use Teeny or any of these things in Node, right? Do we have a couple people? Okay, like half the people. Great. So you know about this problem, and I also have opinions. So I spent years working with teams on managing Node processes in Docker and Swarm and then Kubernetes, and trying to figure out the init problem and process shutdown and basically 0 downtime deploys, never miss a connection, never miss essentially a HTTP ping. And this caused me to go down the rabbit hole of signals and what init processes are really doing, and what does zombie reaping really look like in the wild, and does Node even have these problems? So I came up with a slide that's basically a decision, I ended up making this really complicated decision tree for today, and realized I could just help you with 2 questions. I could tell you whether or not you need this or not. And the first one is, you want to add Teeny in most cases as the thing that will start Node in your container. So not npm. I prefer Teeny because that's what ships with Docker built in. Your app doesn't create sub-processes, which a lot of Node apps don't. They might do calls out to the file system, but they don't necessarily spawn curl or some other binary on the machine. Or if you're in Kubernetes in production, if you didn't know about this option, you can turn on, which isn't turned on by default, unfortunately, the share process namespace. If you do that, Kubernetes has this neat trick where the pause container, who knows about the pause container? Anyone know about the pause container? So the pause container is the first thing in every Kubernetes pod. It's always there. It's super small. It's like 100 lines or 50 lines of code or something. And that thing will do the zombie reaping and the protection and the signal processing that is that you need. It will do that for you, but only if it's sharing the process and namespaces as the rest of the containers in the pod, which unfortunately back in like Kubernetes 1.12 or something, they decided to not do by default. So if you set that true in Kubernetes, all the pods will be in the same all the containers in your pod will be in the same namespace, and essentially Kubernetes gives you a free init manager known as pause. So you don't need Teeny in that case, you can avoid it. The other case is if your app listens for signals in the code, and if you have questions about how to do that, I have a link to my previous talk where I went into the weeds with code examples and counting connections on HTTP so that you can make sure you set them down properly with fin packets. And if you get into networking and nerdy stuff like that, I'll show you the link. I'll give you the link at the end to go find that video. But I'm not going to be able to go through all that today. But if these both are true, then you don't need Teeny. And you can save yourself not really a hassle, but you can avoid an unnecessary encapsulation. So for everyone else, we should have Teeny. We should have Teeny in there, and you shouldn't just have it here. You should probably also use it in any exec probes or any health checks. If you're actually calling out to the file system, you should be using it there as well. This is the talk, it's 2019 actually. It's still all relevant when it comes to process management, signal processing. I personally like to write all of this into my Node app. So my Node app will see the shutdown signals, and the way you know if this works, in case you're not familiar with all this stuff, is if you try to stop a Node container and it takes 10 seconds, because in Docker the default is 10 and Kubernetes is 30 seconds, but if it takes longer than 10 seconds, then you have a init problem, and what's happening is Node is not aware of the signals coming from Linux, the kernel, saying you need to shut down now. And so because the Node by default, and this is true of Python and a lot of other programming languages, they're not trapping those signals by default, so they ignore it, and then Docker has to kill it. So that's what the 10-second wait is. So if you do a lot of online demos of Node app samples, you'll notice like when you Control-C or you Docker stop or whatever you do, it just sits there for 10 seconds. That's because it's not hearing the signals. You can fix all that with an init. All right. I don't need to play the video, so nope, I don't need to do that. Compose updates. Let's talk about Compose, my favorite developer tool. We've had changes in the last 3 or 4 years, so if you haven't been to a previous virtual DockerCon, then you maybe haven't been aware of all these changes, so I'll give you some brief examples of what's changed. We don't have the versions. I mentioned that. Yay, unless you're on Swarm. Sadly, if you're still on Swarm, which is great, I have a growing community of Swarm fans that we're actually going to be meeting in Hallway Track tomorrow. On Swarm, you still need to have the v3 because it's still on an older version of the Compose specification, or it technically doesn't even use it. But for the rest of us, we could get rid of that, which gives us a bunch of features we had over the last 10 years of Compose that we didn't get to use together. Because if you've been around a while, you knew that we had days where you had to decide on v2 versus v3, because features in v2 didn't come into v3, so it was a fork in the road. It was a little complicated. So now all the features that we had in v2 and all the features we had in v3 are all together again as a happy family. And one of my favorites that a lot of teams I work with do not use and did not know about is that people have heard about depends on, but then they realize it doesn't really do what I thought. Like I wanted it to wait for my database to have its schema loaded before the Node app starts. Well, you can do that. You just have to use this specific way to do it. You put in a depends on, and then you define the service that it depends on, like the database, and then you say the condition of service healthy. And I'll just show you the YAML file of that real quick so you know what I'm looking at. And right here is what I would do for my Node app. I say I depend on the DB. The condition must be healthy. And you can do this. I've seen Compose files that have 30 different microservices in it, and they use the new profiles feature to actually put those into chunks so they can load them at separate times. And they depend on Redis and Postgres and a backend worker, and these all things have to be running first. Otherwise, you end up getting like Node crashing and cycling and all that, so you don't really want that in development. So you add that to all of your services that depend on something else, and then in the dependent services, you add a health check. And in a database, this is actually a pretty easy one. If I just go into health checks for Postgres, I can actually go in here, and it does a SQL query and looks for a specific record, so it knows that I've seeded the database. So it's a simple Docker health check. You can, the same kind of health check you would put in Kubernetes. And as long as I have that in my database or my Redis or whatever my backend thing is, when I do a Docker Compose up, it will sit there and wait until that health check passes green before it starts the services. And you can chain these. So you can have the backend API wait on the database, and then the front end waits on the API. You can chain these all the way up, and it's 10 lines of YAML to put it all in there. So we get that now in the latest versions. The next one here includes, extends, and CLO overrides. I don't know if you've all scaled up your compose work, but includes is the brand new feature that allows us to, at the top of a compose file or anywhere, but you put it at the root of a compose file, you can say, here's other files I want you to bring in. Extends, it's a little bit more flexible, and I like it better than extends, which is a very similar feature that we've had for a long time. And then CLO overrides. CLI overrides is honestly the one I use the most because it allows me to give a whole team a compose file, and then I give them, and then they all can make another file called composeoverride.yaml, and that file will change any of the settings, including environment variables, for their development setup. So if they want different ports, or they want different environment variables or different passwords, and then we ignore that file in git ignore so that everyone has their own custom setup without needing a different compose file. You can also do overrides for things like CI testing. So you can have an override that puts in all the CI testing values, and you can have a base regular compose file that's simple, and then override the customizations. That's called overrides. So you can look all those up in the docs. In fact, I was going to click on one and bring it up, but you get the point. They had a blog article recently. Nicholas put up there a great blog post on improving Docker Compose. So they walk through all the different ways to create many different YAML files that build into a single Compose setup, and it's a pretty great walkthrough of all the ways and the pros and cons of each, and why you might want to use one over the other. All right, next up. The develop, did they show this in the keynote? I can't remember. So develop is a brand new thing for Watch. And we'll talk about Watch in a second. Watch is my favorite new feature this year. You also get new features in Docker Compose that most people don't know about. Again, not related to Node, but you get a Docker Compose LS. So if you have multiple projects all running, you can actually see them all in one command. It's pretty handy. You can see if you have stuff running in some other directory that you forgot about. And then Docker Compose Alpha Publish just got launched in the last month. And this is something I've been asking for about 5 years. You can now put your compose files with that command. It will automatically put them in essentially an image and push them to a registry so you can share compose files without code as a deployable object or as an artifact. And we have this for Kubernetes. We have this for Helm, for Kubernetes manifest customize and stuff, but we didn't really have it for Compose until just this last month. So that's there, FYI. So Compose Watch looks like this. At the very top, I'm typing Docker Compose Watch, and it requires some extra YAML, which I will show you in a minute. But once you've added that extra YAML, you no longer need, in most cases, to do bind mounts for development. Who here struggles with npm install performance or build performance on their local machine with bind mounts? Has anybody suffered with that over the years? You've tried mutagen, you've tried Docker Sync. If you go hardcore, you might try rsync, you might do all sorts of crazy stuff. Well, now with the Compose Watch, in a lot of cases, the people that I'm talking to and working with and showing the examples to are saying they can now avoid the bind mounting of their source code, and Docker simply watches for file changes on the host and then copies them in the background into the container, or it will rebuild the image based on your configuration. So it avoids the cross-OS boundary bind mount that us on Mac, especially, a little bit on Windows side, we have to deal with that. So real quick, this will be like my last little show and tell. The last thing here is this section. If you were steely-eyed earlier, you might have saw this and thought, what the heck is that? So this is my Node app, and I'm using this to tell it, if I change the package or the package log file, automatically rebuild the image every time I do a Docker Compose Watch, which is like an up. And then watch for anything in my directory, and if it changes, sync that file into the container while it's still running. Now you would still, in Node, you would still need to probably run this with like a nodemon, because nodemon would then be in the container and would see the changes in the container and restart the app in the container, which is a little bit faster than completely restarting the container. So if you add that in there for your Node apps, it's not Node specific, but it is very handy for Node developers, then whenever you run this, you can actually see what it's doing. It's replacing Docker Compose up because it pulls the images, builds the images, and then spins them all up as their services, and it tells you down at the very bottom in small text, it says, it says watching, and it gives me the paths on my host to where it's watching for changes. So it's like a NodeMon or one of the other file watch utilities, but it's happening across the container boundary without a bind mount. Pretty cool. All right, my last thing here, if you have any questions, I'm going to have a couple of minutes for questions, but this is a quick checklist for going production. And like these are the things that I think of mentally and I work with the team on, regardless of their status with Node. Are they doing these things before we go into production? It's not super focused, but obviously Docker ignore file, like it's amazing how many teams I work with that are maybe in their first year or two of containers that didn't realize they needed a Docker ignore. I just make a copy of the git ignore file and then I add node modules to it, and that usually solves the problem. That they're always running as Node or a non-root user, right? They're using Teeny or another init process. They're calling Node directly without using PM2, NodeMon in production, or NPM or Yarn or any other tool. We want to call Node directly. At least we want to have Teeny call Node directly. We want to have a health check. You're going to need those probes in Kubernetes, but in Docker, you can just type the health check in the Dockerfile. I find that if you have that, then you can use the depends on to wait for the database, right? But in order to do that, so imagine you had an API backend on Node. If you added the health check in the Dockerfile, then the other developers could easily set up that dependency for depends on without needing to have to work on adding a manual health check. So if you put it in the Dockerfile, you can avoid it in the compose file, is essentially what I'm saying. We want to use the omit dev and our npm CI commands. That's always how we want to run production. In your source code, these are the things that I would have you do. I would ask you, assuming that your team is controlling the Node source code, I would ask you to capture SIGTERM and SIGINT processes and handle proper shutdown. I would ask you to track, if you're a website, if you're a web system, if you're looking for zero downtime deployments, essentially, you probably, at some layer of your system, you're going to need to monitor HTTP connections, send FIN packets to the front end browser or whatever it is your client, and have them automatically route to another healthy container because this container is shutting down. And you can look up projects like Stoppable, which is a Node.js npm project out there that will properly count connections, give you FIN packets, which are the way that you do a healthy shutdown of a Node container without without basically cutting people off and giving them a hard connection reset. If you're doing file I/O, a thing that I've learned the last 3 or 4 years working with teams that still are doing a lot of file I/O, like uploading images and storing them in some sort of system on a file system, is that permissions will end up biting you in the butt in production at some point, especially if you're using like NFS or something on the network. So I have them put code in to look for the proper permissions during Node startup, and if they don't see the proper permissions in the places they expect, it will crash the app, because a lot of times what will happen is we'll end up in production, and then days later, someone does a unique thing, like they upload a PDF report in whatever their app is, and then there's a permissions problem because someone changed an AWS EC2 thing, and suddenly we have an outage. Or at least the user gets a really bad experience. So we've learned to just start checking for file permissions if we're going to write to disk during Node startup. If you're listening on HTTP, provide a common standard health endpoint so that Docker, Compose, Swarm, Kubernetes, and all the things can monitor your apps. If you don't use HTTP apps and they don't have a listening port, then typically the way that we do it is we write every 30 seconds, we're writing a health status to a file on disk, and then we're having the probe or the health check look for the date timestamp of that file, or maybe look at the inside of that file for whatever data we gave it. So that's how we deal with non-listening services. And then lastly, on Kubernetes pods, because it's not just about Docker, I have a recommended pod spec that I use with all my consulting clients, all my students. And so that is, go grab that. I'm not going to go through it, not going to have a chance because I got 30 seconds. But you want to have ready, that example gives you all those security features and all the stuff you should have in your pod spec that you may not have today. It talks about probes, it talks about listeners, the termination of the grace period seconds, or termination grace period seconds. Yeah, that's a hard one to say. Disabling privileged and escalations, making sure that you're running as a non-privileged user and enforcing that so that your security team is happy with you. And then finally, enabling seccomp profiles, which Docker has by default, but Kubernetes disables by default unless you do that in every pod or at a level of the cluster. So that's it. That's the repo. I'm going to hang around for questions since I ran out of time. But go there for all this data and more. It's just a GitHub repo. And I will see you at the next one. Thank you.